Hello friends and welcome back to my channel. In this video I'm sharing 4 mixed media stencil techniques that feature layering stencils combined with scrapbook.com pops of color, distress inks, and Crackle texture paste. I've mixed and matched these various mediums to create 4 different cards. The video and walkthrough for each one is coming up next. Here are the 3 layering stencils I'll be using in this video. There is a set of hearts, eggs, and umbrellas. Each set comes with a stencil that has a basic shape and then a second stencil that you can layer on top to add some fun details. Now I don't know about you, but I have quite the collection of stencils. I love to keep my 6x8 stencils in this binder from scrapbook.com. It's pretty full right now, but I currently have 40 stencils in this one binder. Now let's get on to the card making and stencil techniques. To keep it simple, I started each card with the same stamped background. I began with a piece of distress watercolor paper trimmed to 4 by 5 1/4 inches. It has a smooth side, which is what I usually use, and another side that is more traditional watercolor texture. I prefer this type of paper when working with various mediums since it tends to hold up well to them and doesn't warp. The stamp set I'm using is the Tim Holtz Ledger Script. I placed the paper inside my MISTI and used a bit of adhesive on the back side to hold it in place since the stamp covers most of the paper and there is nowhere to place the magnets. I then applied frayed burlap archival ink to the stamp. This is a permanent ink, so you don't have to worry about the ink bleeding when you apply other mediums on top of it. The tool I'm rubbing over the surface of my MISTI is the LDRS Stamp-Pendable Stamping Tool. I have a bit of arthritis in my hands, and I have found this to be a great way to apply pressure when stamping large images or background stamps. For this first card, I'm using the Heart Patterns layering stencil. As you can see, I'm positioning the base stencil design at an angle for a bit of interest. Once I had the stencil where I wanted it, I used a piece of mint tape, which is a low tack tape, to hold the stencil in place. Next, I used a blending brush to apply Kitsch Flamingo Distress ink through the stencil. I find these soft bristle brushes to give me a more crisp image when it comes to working with stencils as compared to a foam blending brush. But they can both work to apply ink, so definitely use what you have. Once I finished applying ink to the stencil, it was time for the mixed media fun to begin. I took the more detailed stencil and laid it on top of the inked area. I once again used mint tape to hold the stencil in place. I then applied a layer of Tim Holtz Ranger Ink Crackle texture paste through the stencil using a palette knife. After I applied the paste, I gently removed the stencil to wash it and set the paper to the side to let the paste dry. Here's where the pops of color comes into play. Using a Q-tip, I applied soft pink pops of color to the areas where I had applied the Crackle paste. Because this has a pearl finish, it adds a touch of shimmer to the design. And while it may seem subtle, I promise you, in real life, it really adds an extra little something special. Once the background was dry, I inked the edges with frayed burlap distress ink. For the sentiment on this card, I used the scrapbook.com Love Die. I cut it from white cardstock and applied mint tape to the back side to hold the inside letters in place. I then adhered a piece of double-sided foam adhesive to the back side of another piece of white cardstock and die cut it again. I took the one that was only cardstock and applied embossing ink to it, sprinkled it with salvaged patina embossing glaze, and heat embossed it. I do recommend using a pair of tweezers or a clothespin to hold the paper while you're heat embossing so you don't burn your fingers. I repeated the heat embossing a second time to create a nice smooth surface. I then used Distress Collage Medium to adhere the letters to the cardstock piece with the foam adhesive on the back side. Next, I selected a coordinating color of paper from the Scrapbook.com Sherbet paper pad. Before I adhered the word die cut, I added these beautiful botanical die cuts from the Scrapbook.com Sprigs die set. To help place the word die cut, I removed the liner and then placed the die cut on the edge of it. I then used this to help center it on my card front. Card number 1 is complete. I love how the pops of color and Crackle paste add a combination of shimmer, shine, and texture to the card. Now on to the second card and technique. Here I'm using the same stamp background I used on the first card, but this time I'm working with the eggs layering stencils. I began by applying distressed texture paste through the stencil using a palette knife. Once all of the openings were filled, I gently removed the stencil to wash it and set the paper to the side to dry. Once it was dry, I grabbed pops of color in soft pink, lemon chiffon, and seafoam. Using a Q-tip, I applied the color to the eggs, making sure to alternate them as I moved down the paper. As you can see, I used a different tip to apply each color. Because you are applying such a small amount of the pops of color, this will dry rather quickly. With the background complete and the pops of color dry, I inked the edges with frayed burlap distress ink. You could certainly skip this step if you prefer a brighter, less grungy look. To embellish this card, I selected a pink paper from the Scrapbook.com Peppermint paper pad and used one sheet as the base for my card. Using that same sheet of paper, I also die cut one of the bunnies from the Bunny Hops Thinlits dies so as not to waste any paper. I wanted the bunny to have a bit more sturdiness, so I also die cut it from a piece of Distress Heavy Stock and adhered the layers using collage medium. I added a couple of die cut greenery pieces from the Scrapbook.com Sprigs die set and used a tape runner to attach them to the bunny. To create the sentiment on this card, I used the Tim Holtz Spring Shadows stamp set. I stamped it in Salvage Patina archival ink and then trimmed it down and adhered it to the card using double-sided foam adhesive. To give the bunny a little more dimension, I used some double-sided foam squares to attach it to the card front. With that, card number 2 is completed. Again, I just love the texture and shine from the pops of color and Crackle paste. Well, if you're still with me, here is the third technique. This time I'm combining ink and pops of color with the umbrellas layering stencils and the same stamped background I used on the other 2 cards. By now, I was starting to rethink this choice of the same background, but I decided to just stick with it. Once I had the stencil in place, I ink blended Salvage Patina Distress ink through the bottom stencil. Next, I took the top detailed stencil and lined it up with the ink design. Now it's time to have some mixed media fun with the Ocean Waves pops of color and Thermoweb Decofoil transfer gel. When I've tried to apply pops of color directly through a stencil, it always bleeds under the stencil. I have found that by mixing it with this transfer gel that it thickens it enough that this doesn't happen. It does knock the shimmer down a little, but I still love the effect once it dries. As far as how to mix them together, it's really about thickening the pops of color. So as you add the pops of color to the gel, you will notice that it thickens just a little, and once this happens, you have the right consistency. I would recommend playing around on a few scraps of paper until you get a good feel for it. Most of the time, you're using double the amount of pops of color to the transfer gel. I have mixed the pops of color with other mediums to achieve some fun effects, and if you are interested in learning more, I invite you to check out my 3 ways to use scrapbook.com pops of color blog post. I'll link to it in the description. After you apply this mixture, gently remove the stencil and set the paper to the side to dry. I recommend immediately washing your stencil or placing it in a tray of water to wash at a later time. Once the background was dry, I selected a background paper for the card front from the scrapbook.com Cools paper pad. For the embellishment on this card, I used the scrapbook.com nested fancy circle dies and cut it once from the same teal color as the background, and then a second time from white cardstock. For the sentiment, I used the scrapbook.com Feel Better Sentiments 2 stamp set. If you're looking for Get Well sentiment, scrapbook.com has you covered with these 2 sets. I stamped the sentiment in embossing ink onto a piece of teal paper and heat embossed it with white embossing powder. I then die cut it using a circle die. To finish it off, I added the sprig die cut. Technique number 3 is complete, and once again, I love the shimmer and shine the pops of color adds. This 4th and final card uses pops of color and pops of color. I'm using the egg stencil again, but this time I'm using both stencil layers. On the first layer, I create a mixture of the soft pink pops of color with a thermo web transfer gel. Remember, you're just trying to thicken the pops of color a bit. Once it's thickened, apply it through the base stencil using a palette knife. If you need to make more, just repeat the same mixing process. Once all the openings are covered, gently remove the stencil, wash it, and set the paper to the side to dry. This piece will take the longest of all the techniques to dry because you are putting on more of the mixture. Dry time will depend on temperature and humidity, so I recommend doing this at a time when you aren't in a hurry and can let it dry thoroughly. With the background dry, it's time for the next layer. Take the detailed egg stencil layer and line it up with the bottom egg design. Next, take the bubblegum pops of color and mix it with the transfer gel and apply it through the stencil. Remember to make sure that the pops of color has thickened a little before you apply it. I have found it to be the most helpful to pay attention to how it feels when mixing it than just what it looks like. I think this is such a fun look with the pops of color layered on top of each other like this. For this card, I selected some papers from the Sherbet paper pad and once again used the cute Bunny Hops Thinlits die. I die cut a different bunny this time, but once again layered it with Distress Heavy Stock and adhered them together using collage medium. I also used a similar design as the first Easter card I shared and once again added some of the sprig dies. Once this was done, I began assembling the card as I did before, using double-sided foam adhesive to pop up the bunny and sentiment strip. And there you have it. I hope you enjoyed learning these 4 mixed media stencil techniques featuring pops of color, distress inks, and Crackle texture paste. Thanks so much for watching. I'm truly grateful for you. I was wondering if you could do me a quick favor and subscribe to my channel or leave me a thumbs up or a comment. If you're feeling extra generous, I'd love for you to share about my channel with your friends. All of these things help out us YouTubers so much, and it would mean so much to me to have your support.